Part 1. The town called her a liar before she ever spoke a full sentence, as if the verdict had been waiting for her all along. Clara Hale stood on the wooden steps of the general store with the sun at her back and the wind tugging loose strands of hair from her braid. She held a creased letter in both hands, knuckles pale, the paper worn thin from being unfolded and folded again like a prayer that refused to fade. The bell above the store door jingled behind her, and the murmurs grew, low at first, then sharper, like stones clicking together. "She's back again," someone said. "Still telling that story," another replied, half amused, half annoyed. Clara lifted her chin and spoke anyway. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried, steady as a creek after rain. She said the land beyond the cottonwoods belonged to her family. She said her father had left it to her, sealed and signed, with witnesses whose names were still alive somewhere in the county books. She said she wasn't asking for charity, only for what was already hers. The laughter came quickly, brittle and practiced. Men leaned against hitching posts, women paused mid-gossip, children stared with the frank curiosity of those who hadn't yet learned how cruelty worked. Papers could be forged, they said. Stories could be invented. A girl who'd grown up poor learned how to lie early, didn't she? The sheriff shifted his weight and scratched his jaw, eyes sliding away from Clara's face as if meeting her gaze might bind him to something uncomfortable. Across the street, Jonah Reed watched from the shade of the feed store awning. He stood apart from the others, hat pulled low, arms folded across a chest hardened by years of sun and labor. Folks trusted Jonah. His word weighed more than most, and everyone knew it. He paid his debts on time, fixed fences that weren't his when storms tore them down, and never raised his voice unless a calf was stuck in a ravine. If Jonah Reed said something was true, the town would listen. He said nothing. Clara's eyes found him, as they always did. There was no accusation in her look, only a quiet expectation that hurt more than anger would have. Jonah felt it like a hand closing around his throat. He had seen that letter before, had seen its seal, its careful script. He had seen it years ago, when his father sat at the kitchen table with a bottle of cheap whiskey and a stack of old deeds, hands trembling more from guilt than drink. Jonah remembered the smell of smoke that night, remembered the way the flames curled the edges of paper until names disappeared. He told himself that was the past. He told himself a man couldn't answer for his father's sins forever. The sheriff cleared his throat and said there wasn't enough proof to act on. The town nodded, relieved to be spared the trouble of doubt. Someone suggested Clara stop stirring things up. Someone else told her it was time to move on. Jonah's silence settled over it all like dust, sealing the decision. Clara folded the letter with careful hands. Her shoulders stayed straight as she stepped down from the store porch, though her boots hesitated for the briefest moment on the last step. She passed Jonah without a word, close enough that he caught the faint scent of soap and travel-worn clothes. For an instant, he thought she might stop him, might ask him outright to remember. She didn't. She walked on alone, the town parting for her and then closing again, its judgment already fixed in place. Jonah stayed where he was long after the crowd drifted back to their business. He told himself silence was mercy, that speaking now would only make things worse, that old wrongs buried deep enough eventually turned to soil. He told himself the truth had a way of finding daylight without him pushing it there. Yet as Clara's figure shrank down the road, a hollow opened in his chest, cold and widening. The wind shifted, carrying the sound of cottonwood leaves rustling somewhere beyond town. Jonah knew that land. He knew its boundaries better than most. And for the first time, he wondered how long a man could stand on stolen ground before it finally gave way beneath his feet. Part 2. Days passed, and the town settled back into its familiar rhythm, as if Clara Hale's claim had been nothing more than a brief disturbance in still water. The sun rose and set over the same streets, the same false certainties. Yet beneath that calm, lines were being redrawn. Survey stakes appeared beyond the cottonwoods, driven into the earth with decisive blows. Fresh wire glinted in the light as new fences went up, their straight lines cutting through land that had once lain open and quiet. Jonah Reed watched the work from horseback, his cattle already nosing the grass there, their hooves pressing ownership into soil that remembered other footsteps. He told himself he was only following what the sheriff had decided. He told himself the town needed order more than questions. Still, every time his horse crossed the shallow creek and climbed the rise toward the cottonwoods, his chest tightened. He knew where the old boundary markers were supposed to be, knew about the stone with the small cross etched into it, half buried and easy to miss if you didn't know to look. His father had shown it to him once, years ago, with a warning that had sounded like advice but felt like fear. Clara returned at dusk 3 days after the fences went up. The sky was bruised purple and gold, and the wind carried the promise of rain that never quite came. Jonah was repairing a broken rail when he saw her walking up the drive, dust on her hem, her posture careful but unbowed. No one else was around. The ranch hands had gone in for supper. For a moment, Jonah considered pretending he hadn't seen her. She stopped a few steps away and waited until he set the hammer down. Her eyes were tired, shadowed by nights that had offered little rest. "I'm not here to make trouble," she said, before he could speak. "I just need you to tell me something." Jonah wiped his hands on his trousers and nodded, though his pulse quickened. Clara asked him if he remembered the old markers, the ones set before the war, before lines had been shifted and records lost. She asked about the stone with the cross, the one her father had shown her when she was a girl. She didn't accuse him. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke as if the truth were a shared object between them, something solid they could both reach for. Jonah remembered everything. He remembered riding beside his father as a boy, the man's voice low and uneasy as he explained how some land was claimed by ink instead of right. He remembered the night of the fire, the way his father had stared into the flames too long, as if hoping they would absolve him. Jonah had promised himself then that he would be different, that he would build something clean. He looked past Clara, toward the darkening fields. The silence stretched. Finally, he said, "I don't know what good it would do to dig up old things." The words sounded thin even to him. Clara studied his face, as if searching for the place where the answer might have been. "Then this is goodbye," she said softly. She thanked him for his time, a courtesy that cut deeper than anger would have, and turned away before he could change his mind. 2 days later, the sheriff posted the notice. The land was officially seized and reassigned, stamped and signed with the authority of the county. Folks gathered to read it, nodding with satisfaction at the neat finality of it all. Jonah stood among them, his head in his hands, feeling the weight of eyes that trusted him without question. Someone clapped him on the shoulder and congratulated him on securing his borders. He forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Clara packed her things that night. A neighbor saw her loading a small wagon by lantern light, the letter folded and tucked into her coat as if it were a talisman rather than proof. No one offered help. By morning, she was gone. Jonah rode the range alone that day. He told himself he was protecting what was his ranch, his men, his father's legacy. He told himself he couldn't save everyone. But the land felt different beneath him, as though it were holding its breath. Every fence post seemed to accuse. Every lowing cow echoed too loudly. He realized then that he hadn't lost Clara when she left town. He had lost something in himself the moment he chose not to speak. And though he couldn't yet name the cost, he felt it growing, patient and inevitable, like a storm building beyond the horizon. Part 3. The truth did not arrive gently. It came on a windless morning when the dust lay flat and the sky was so clear it felt accusing. A stranger rode into town just after sunrise, an older man with a stiff leg and a leather satchel worn smooth by years of travel. He introduced himself as a surveyor, hired by a distant cousin of Clara Hale who had refused to let the matter die. Word spread quickly, as it always did. By noon, the general store porch was crowded again, the same boards that had borne Clara's quiet humiliation now creaking under the weight of expectation. The surveyor laid out his ledger on a barrel. The pages were yellowed but intact, the ink dark and deliberate. He spoke slowly, patiently, pointing to dates, measurements, and signatures that predated the town's neat reassignment by decades. He described the stone marker with the etched cross and its exact placement relative to the creek in the cottonwoods. A murmur moved through the crowd, uncertain at first, then unsettled. This was not a story that could be laughed away. All eyes turned to Jonah Reed. Jonah felt the moment settle on his shoulders like a yoke. He could feel his father's presence as keenly as if the man were standing beside him, feel the old warning, the old fear. He could still choose silence. He could say the ledger meant nothing, that memories were unreliable, that the past was too tangled to untie. The town wanted that answer. He saw it in their faces. Instead, Jonah stepped forward. His voice didn't rise, but it carried. He told them about the letter he had seen years ago, about the night of the fire and the deeds that burned. He told them what his father had done to secure land that was never meant to be his, and what he himself had done by saying nothing when it mattered. The words cost him with every breath. Each sentence felt like pulling a nail from his own house. The sheriff's face hardened, then fell. The crowd's certainty fractured, splitting into disbelief, anger, and shame. Some looked at Jonah as if seeing him for the first time. Others looked away, unwilling to share the burden of what he'd said. By evening, the decision was reversed. The land beyond the cottonwoods was returned to its rightful claim. Notices were taken down as quickly as they'd been posted. The town congratulated itself on correcting a mistake, as if the correction erased the harm. Someone asked when Clara would be sent for. She didn't come back. Jonah rode out to the edge,